Greetings. This is the commentary and what I call a sermonette on my pre-Christian song called Most All the Time. I believe this was one of the last songs I wrote before I became a Christian. So I'm thinking this was probably 1976. And if you can look at the paper, you can see how aged it looks, because this is now 2026. So that means that would have been about 50 years ago. My goodness, lifetime. The reason that I'm recording some of my pre-Christian songs, as I've stated in a couple of my other commentaries, if you've seen that, you got to hear this again, is that if someone can relate with the questions that I was wrestling with, or the confusion as I was looking for meaning or purpose to life, if you can relate to any of my lyrics, then I'm here to share that where I found my answers came from this book and the actual author of this book. The Bible is really just a tool to lead us to God. Even the name of it, the Bible, it really just means book. How much more humble can you get than that? He calls himself the Word, and the words of this book are actually an extension of him. So this is where I have found my answers, and this is where I point people to. So let's just now get right into the lyrics. Searching deep inside my soul, not quite sure what I control. Searching deep and far and wide, not quite sure what I should hide. That just all speaks for itself. And then I get into the first verse. How can you know the meaning of life if you haven't lived to see all points of view? How can you tell when the rush serves you well, or when to let time be the helm of your truth? When we see ourselves wrong, shouldn't it help us along instead of blocking our way? Help me open my eyes to see a much brighter world than the one I find myself lost in most all the time. Most all the time. As I started preparing a few little notes for this, it struck me, how can you know the meaning of life if you haven't lived to see all points of view? It never occurred to me, if there is one who created life, then what would be the most important vantage point to peer would be from his viewpoint. If he made life, he would know the meaning of it. So I don't really need any other points of view, my point of view or anybody else's, if we can know his point of view to the meaning of life. That's really what this is all about. It truly is. Boil it all down, this is what's in this book. Now, when I question in this next line, how can you tell when the rush serves you well, or when to let time be the helm of your truth? Isn't that the source of so much confusion, not knowing what to do or not do a lot of times? Some people just bull ahead and they just do whatever is in front of them. They don't give much thought to it. But if you have people that are a little more reflective, especially if you get burned a time or two because of choices you've made out of rashness, then you begin to question, do I need to slow down a little bit, or do I need to push forward? I mean, what is the pace with which to move? I mean, when do you seize? When do you not seize an opportunity? And so it's just questions that there will be no answers to. And even as a Christian, this is something very difficult a lot of times to know. Sometimes God will let you know beforehand, this is the way, walk in it. There's other times I've made a lot of decisions, and it isn't until I'm at the conclusion that it's like this was the right thing to have done. I won't get into a lot of stories because this becomes very subjective. But if you're apart from God, it's just a guessing game. If you're in the Lord, he says he creates us for good works that he's prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. He's got a design and a purpose for our life, and as we seek him, he will open up doors that no one can shut. He'll also close doors that no one can open, and he promises he'll lead us and guide us for his name's sake. We represent him, and he gives direction to our life that you're not going to find outside of Jesus Christ. It isn't there. Well, when we see ourselves wrong, I'm asking in my song, shouldn't it help us along instead of blocking our way? In other words, mistakes block our way, but shouldn't it help us along where we learn from our mistakes? You make blunders and you make errors. And shouldn't it help us along where we gain experience? But again, as a non-Christian, it's like, where does that ultimately lead me? Maybe I'll stay out of some trouble, but there's still not clear direction. And that's why I say, help me open my eyes to see a much brighter world than the one I find myself lost in most all the time. Do you feel like that? Yeah, that's how I felt. Now, verse 2. How can I learn that person in you if you haven't learned that person yourself? I'm actually asking that of myself. Like, how can I learn that person in you if you haven't learned that person yourself? So it's directed both ways, outward towards someone else, but inward towards me. How can I learn that person in you if you haven't learned that person yourself, Robin? How can I learn him if you haven't? I told my daughter and son-in-law, who recently went through a transition, and they learned things about themselves, and they look at that year chapter as not mistakes. It served its purpose, but they learned some things about themselves as a couple, but also as individuals. And I said, well, there's a guy named Socrates that lived thousands of years ago, and in all his thinking and philosophy, he's known for one primary thing: know thyself. Of course, he didn't speak English, so no telling what he actually said, but to know yourself. And I said, think about that. He's saying after all the searching, the main thing is to know yourself. In other words, what brings you joy? What brings you satisfaction? What kind of work? What kind of activities? What kind of hobbies? Where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses? Where do your strengths become a weakness? Where you're strong-willed, but then it bleeds over where it messes other things up? Or when does a strength of a patient and gentle spirit, when does that become a weakness? When you don't stand up to stop something when you should. In other words, to know yourself. That is the big goal. So how can I know that person in you? Because that's what I'm really searching for in here, in this song. How can I know that person in you, Robin, if you haven't learned that person yourself? How can I know when I should let go or when to cling to all I think I've got? When we see we don't belong, shouldn't it make us feel strong instead of mocking our way and blocking our way? Help me open my eyes to see a much brighter world than the one I find myself lost in most all the time. Most all the time. And then I sing that 2 more times. Most all the time. Most all the time. Part of that phrase of when we see we don't belong, shouldn't it make us feel strong? Part of my thinking behind that was, why go through all the effort and sacrifice for education, work life, to work 40 years, maybe 50, then you die and that's it? What's the point? Well, many would say that's negative thinking. I would say, because I don't belong, that's realistic thinking. Not negative, it's realistic. Yeah, it's a negative, but it's a realism. Why do that? Why go to all the effort? What is the point? So when we see we don't belong, shouldn't it make us feel strong instead of mocking our way and blocking your way? In other words, you're a freak, you're not thinking right. Help me open my eyes to see a much brighter world than the one I find myself lost in most all the time, because I can't help but see it, and I don't see the point of it, and I'm lost in it. I don't know if you can relate with any of this or not, but that's where my mind was at. But more than that, your emotions are in this, your whole soul, your heart, everything. This is where you're at. Well, when I say that this book has answers, let me just give you a little example. Second verse, how can I know when I should let go or when to cling to all I think that I've got? Listen to this. No one, after lighting a lamp, covers it over. He puts it on a lampstand in order that those who come in may see the light. Well, boy, I could sure use some light. I found myself in a dark world that needed some light. For nothing is hidden that shall not become evident, nor anything secret that shall not be known and come to light. Therefore take care how you listen, for whoever has, to him shall more be given, and whoever does not have, even what he thinks he has, shall be taken away from him. How can I know when I should let go or when to cling to all I think I've got? Jesus said that when you're outside of him, even what he thinks he has shall be taken away from him. Another way he brought this home: let the brother of humble circumstances glory in his high position, and let the rich man glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind, and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. To reach the pinnacle of a career or the prime of life, there's a scorching wind that comes and beats it back down. The first thing to go is the flower fades, and then the grass goes. That is why the rich man needs to be humble, because if he's prideful, he's going to be humbled and humiliated, because the beauty of its appearance, whatever it is he's gained, he's going to have to leave it. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. In the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, Job had some horrendous troubles that came his way. And the thrust of his three friends was, you must have done something wrong and God is punishing you, so you might as well confess it, get right with God, and he'll restore you. And Job was saying, I didn't do anything. Well, these three friends, in their speeches that they would give as they took turns talking, some of it would be correct and then it would get off. But one of the fellows, his name was Bildad, he was saying to Job, can the papyrus grow without marsh? The answer is no. Can the rushes grow without water? The answer is no. Well, while it is still green and not cut down, yet it withers before any other plant. So evidently, even though it's got everything for life, it still withers before some of the other plants. It still just has a short lifespan and dies unexpectedly. I mean, I've had trees around here that it just dies for some reason. You don't even know why it died. There's the next one right to it, same kind, is just fine. Both got water, everything else, one of them just dies. Well, this particular one, it withers before any other plant. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the godless will perish, whose confidence is fragile and whose trust a spider's web. He trusts in his house, but it does not stand. He holds fast to it, but it does not endure. He thrives before the sun, and his shoots spread out over his garden. His roots wrap around a rock pile. He grasps a house of stone. So a person gets planted, gets secure, gets everything built up around him. Yet when he's removed from his place, then it will deny him, saying, I never saw you. We can build a kingdom, and when we leave, we've brought nothing into the world. We can't take anything with us. That place that we were at will deny us, saying, I never saw you. Never even knew you were here. So I've got a road back here. It's 526 or Mount Olivet Road that goes to the high school and the junior high school where both my daughters went. My mom and dad would come to visit. We'd go up and down that road several times to different school activities. My mom and dad have died, and that road is still there. There was one time I'm looking at that road and I said, my mom and dad were here, now they're gone, and you, a stupid road, you're still here. This is not the way it's supposed to be, where a road has more durability than we do. But the place denies, saying, I never saw you. I wrote a little note here. It's like we're all ultimately alone. It's like when I'm saying, help me open my eyes to see a much brighter world than the one I find myself lost in most all the time. Ultimately, we are alone, and that's why we need God. I was driving the other day and I was thinking about the lyrics of this song, and I realized that before I became a Christian, I was trapped inside of my own mind. One of the big problems I had as I was analyzing things, I knew that while some people were smarter than others, I knew that ultimately we were all in the same boat, so to speak. Mortal, It was like, your opinions or your thinking, why is it any better than mine? I'd gotten to that point where I just couldn't see the superiority of anybody else's thinking. Ultimately, when it came to these basic questions, you'd go to a certain point and then it's like you couldn't get any answers of any substance that really meant anything as far as purpose to life, meaning to life, and these matters like I'm talking about here, or the darkness of life, the reality of life. And what I was thanking God about was that now, even driving around, I'm talking to Him, and it's led not to a closed environment, but an open end. I can communicate with Him, and He can communicate with me primarily through His Word, and I can gain information that is substantive and deep. And one of the primary drivers on this, when I decided just to read the Bible, nobody was preaching at me. I didn't even know anybody that was a Christian at that time. And I just decided I wanted to read it. And I would find things that made me want to read more. And I've talked about this in some other videos. On one hand, He'd convict me over things and confront me. But it wasn't just that. On the other hand, He would communicate something that it's like, what? Where'd that come from? What else does this book have to say? Well, one of the things that happened as I was reading it, I would be talking to people about the Bible, and I was at this park one night, and I was talking to this fellow. We were watching some tennis players, and he listened to me, and he said, well, have you ever read the Gospels? And I said, what's that? He said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, that was my next assignment. So I started reading Matthew. I read through it, and I get to the end, and Jesus was tried, scourged, crucified, buried, and 3 days later rose from the dead. And I said, what? Rose from the dead, came out of the tomb. Who's Matthew? Is this a real person? I mean, who is this? Well, then I went to the end of Mark, Luke, and John. They're all saying the same thing. Jesus was real. He was here. Here's a lot of things that He did. They killed Him, and He rose from the dead 3 days later. It's like, well, who is Mark, and who is Luke, and who is John? Are these real people? Did they witness this? And the realization began to come to me that if this was true, that He was physically dead and then rose from the dead and is alive forever, because they went on to talk about things He did after His resurrection, then He has authority. Jesus has authority that nobody else has, and I would be willing to listen to Him. That is the key to Christianity. That is the entire key. It's a stamp of God's authority upon the Son of God, where Jesus actually raised Himself from the dead. He was given that authority and had that power, which He declared beforehand, even before His death. But it began to register with me that if this was true, then He indeed has the answers to all of these materials and questions that I had struggled and wrestled with. The darkness that I talked about, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. Now that is either true or it's not true. I would submit to you that what He's primarily talking about, the light of the world, is information, enlightenment. That's what He's come to do, to teach us great and mighty things that we do not know when we call upon Him and when we seek Him, He says, with our whole heart. As I said earlier, He calls Himself the Word, which is knowledge and information. And I want to end with this. I think if you can reflect on the lyrics that I had here, I was struggling with life. And there's one point Jesus said to one of the churches, and this would be to the individuals, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, Him communicating through His word, and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me. He who overcomes, I will grant him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, Let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. When he says that he stands at the door and knocks, well, let me ask you this. If someone is knocking at the door and wants to come in and have a meal with you, is it to argue about all kinds of stuff, or is it to have a conversation? Jesus is a gentleman in that he knocks on the door. If we respond, he'll come in and we can ask him anything we want to ask him. He is not intimidated by our intellect. He's not intimidated by our life experience. He's not intimidated by our questions and by our objections and by our beefs. He's not surprised by anything we come up with. We can contend with him on any issue that we have. He says, bring your strong arguments forward and let's see if you're going to be proved right. And he is more than willing to sit and dine with you and with me as a friend. We may not always like what he has to say to us. We may wish things were different. A friend loves at all times, and faithful are the wounds of a friend, he says. So he's going to explain things to us, much we will like. The bulk of this book, I am thrilled with what he has to say. There are some things I do not like, and there have been times that I've had to ask him that if I'm to serve him in righteousness, peace, and in joy, I need some answers on some things that can't just be cliche answers. Because I can't serve him in righteousness, peace, and joy if I got these things dogging me. So that's just to say that God wants authenticity of us. And I believe even this song, it was authentic. There's an authenticity here. I didn't even know I was looking for him, but he knew it. And I am so grateful that even though it was not owed to me to address these matters and to assist me, he decided to come knock on the door and gave me the power to open it and willingness to sit down and dine with him. And I still am. And I have absolutely no regrets. He says that if we will change our mind, that's what repentance is. It means to after mind. It's where you've come to a conclusion on something and then you revisit that conclusion, you after mind it. And if we will change our mind in terms of who he is and we need assistance, we cannot navigate this successfully on our own. He promises that will be a repentance without regret. He will make sure that we don't say, golly, I wish I would have never done that. His job is to make sure we don't regret that. I tell you, the only thing I do regret is the times that I fought against him and didn't yield sooner. That's where I have regret, even as a Christian. There has been no time that I've ever turned to him, listened to him, responded to him, to later say, that was a bad decision. It's never happened, and it will never happen. And the reason it won't is because that's his job to make sure that I or you will never regret this movement we make towards him. That's who he is. So I would say, come on in, because if you'll listen, you're going to learn great and mighty things that you do not know, things you haven't even thought about. And when you learn this material, it only leads to one place, life, and you will indeed live.